I don't make it back. Tell my story.
When I first heard that there was a new Garfield movie in development, I gotta be honest, I didn't have particularly high hopes. Not that I was absolutely loathing the concept, I just didn't see much reason to get excited for it. This was partly because Garfield doesn't exactly have the best track record with movies, and especially due to the fact that Chris Pratt would be starring in it.
Probably one of my top 26 favorite cheeses.
I don't know. I love Chris Pratt, but I think the announcement coming just a couple months after the news that he was playing Mario, which was already a pretty controversial choice, kinda made it seem like just another film in the recent wave of over-praturation. Say what you want about the live-action movies, but at least casting Bill Murray seemed like a good idea on paper.
I hate Mondays.
Then the trailers came out, and I mean, it didn't look bad, but it didn't look like anything particularly special either. All we saw was the dramatic scene of John finding Garfield as a kitten and offering him a bite of his food, where you see the punchline coming a mile away.
You want a little more?
And then the rest of the trailer was just fairly generic Garfield jokes like, he eats lasagna, he's lazy, he doesn't like Mondays for whatever reason the writers have gone with this time to avoid the equally overused joke from the audience.
He's a cat, he doesn't have a job.
It also didn't paint a great first impression that one of the pop-up ads I saw for the movie on YouTube clearly wasn't titled correctly when it was uploaded. But I thought I would at least check it out and give it a fair chance. So let's talk about what I actually thought about it. Real quick before we start though, if you like this video, consider supporting me on Patreon. For just $1.50 a month, you'll get access to all my videos before they get released on YouTube, and you'll get a shout out at the end of every video. So when I first sat down to watch this movie, I'm gonna be honest, I was not feeling it at first. The initial wave of jokes seemed fairly predictable for a Garfield movie, like I was expecting. But then a few minutes in, it actually started growing on me, and I realized that the humor is a lot more clever and varied than I was giving it credit for. There's a lot of fairly good absurdist comedy that catches you off guard and can be pretty creative. Some examples being John calling an automated phone line and having to jump through increasingly ridiculous hoops to actually get to speak to a human.
Your call is very important. There are
1,046
people ahead of you.
There's this one villain dog whose skin is so flappy he seems to have infinite hammer space in his folds. There's one scene where the villains do that cartoon thing where they hide behind something that's way too thin for them, but it still covers them perfectly. Except here, it's done in 3D animation, where the added depth helps to heighten the nonsensical nature of the joke even more than if it was just a 2D drawing. There's an evil cheese factory that the characters have to infiltrate, and it's depicted as this tiny, quaint, down-to-earth, family-friendly theme park in front of this massive, dark, and sinister-looking building. The idea being this maniacal mega-corporation portraying themselves as this small organization because it's good PR. Also, they have this giant cow statue overlooking the park, but this one promotional clip on YouTube calls it a dog. Who handled the marketing for this movie? The same people in charge of the animation for the Garfield show? Still though, there's a lot of really good physical comedy, which is helped quite a bit by the expressive animation, and it makes for a lot of really good slapstick and action sequences. There are some fun concepts like the characters trying to survive the cheese factory, which contains some very fast-paced movement and plenty of ideas on what you can do with cheese of all things in an action scene. Or in the climax, how they incorporate drone-delivered pizza boxes for the characters to ride on. In fact, the animation in general is really strong. They did a great job of translating the art style from the comics into 3D, and it's helped by the fact that these character designs are mainly a bunch of simple shapes. And that's accentuated by the fact that the storyboarding and cinematography stick to straightforward perspectives like what the comics themselves tend to do. As for Chris Pratt as Garfield, I once again have to make a comparison to his performance as Mario, in the sense that yeah, he wouldn't have been my first choice, but he plays the role fine enough. And to be fair, in retrospect, this isn't nearly as much of a stretch for him as when he played Mario, because at least here, Garfield has pretty much always sounded like a normal guy.
What could be worse than Monday?
So it's much easier to adjust to Chris Pratt voicing Garfield compared to when he voiced a character that originally sounded like this. So yeah, Chris Pratt is okay. I think he handles the zanier parts of Garfield's personality a bit better than the more lazy and subdued parts, which adds up considering the performances he's most well known for.
Boom, that's spaghetti. Nachos.
That's my cat.
But he's not bad, all things considered. Samuel L. Jackson is also present as Garfield's dad, Vic, and he also does a perfectly fine job. It's basically Jackson playing the type of character he usually plays, just with a lot less use of the word motherfucking. That part I'm very disappointed about.
Well done.
But it's still Sam Jackson being his usual self, which is always great to see, so I can't stay too mad at it. And on top of that, the rest of the characters are actually characterized pretty well too. Odie is also along for the adventure, and he's probably the biggest departure the movie makes from the source material. He's not portrayed as particularly upbeat or unintelligent like he usually is. He more just kind of nonchalantly hangs out in the background, typically just minding his own business and occasionally just casually coming to the rescue when he's needed. Yeah, it's different, and he maybe could have directly factored into the plot a bit more, but I find it kind of funny how he's essentially just hanging out for most of the movie, only getting highly involved when need be. The villain of the movie, named Jinx, is also a pretty decent bad guy. Admittedly, her backstory is a little forgettable, but she's just a fun, purely evil antagonist, similar to a classic Disney villain like Ursula or Cruella de Vil. The other thing that really surprised me with the movie is the fact that the character development and plot are actually kind of sweet and heartfelt. The basic plot is that Garfield gets reunited with Vic after being left by him as a kitten, which Garfield is less than pleased about.
This is Vic, my father.
Vic is an alley cat stuck having to pay off a debt to Jinx by robbing a dairy factory for milk. Throughout the first half of the movie, Garfield is resentful towards Vic because, as far as he's aware, Vic abandoned him. Without spoiling anything, there's some pretty good character development with the two of them learning to get along and Garfield realizing that Vic cares about him more than he realized as a kid. It's honestly kind of endearing to see the lengths that Vic is willing to go to for Garfield, often sacrificing his own well-being and happiness so that Garfield can keep his. And on the other side, it's nice to see Garfield put his usual apathy for other people aside and learn to care about his dad. I will say that while the character development itself is pretty good, the plot doesn't utilize it as best as it could. The movie is essentially a heist story for the majority of the runtime, where two characters who don't get along have to put aside their differences and work together. Generally in that type of plot, you would have these characters initially fail to work together because they can't cooperate. That then forces them to talk out their differences and make them more capable of working together. But the problem I have is that they're not struggling due to unresolved conflicts between them. It's more just because the character helping to plan the heist, a bull named Otto, just isn't good at training them. Like I said, the arc between Garfield and Vic still works because they have the good emotional beats to back it up. It's just that the way it's incorporated into the plot kind of doesn't have as much of a sense of stakes as it otherwise could have. Speaking of Otto, he has a stake of his own in the heist with him wanting to rescue his girlfriend who the theme park is keeping in captivity in their petting zoo. It's not a bad subplot, and it can be kind of emotional at times, but I feel like you could cut both of these characters out of the plot entirely and not a lot would really change. And if I had to bring up one other issue that I had, it would be that as much as I've praised the comedy in the movie, the jokes do kind of start to slow down as the movie goes on. The humor that still shows up later on is still good. I mean, for the most part, Garfield eats bird shit at one point, which is about as funny as it sounds. But I do remember a lot more of the best jokes coming from the first half of the runtime than the second half. But still, even with a few problems in mind, it's still a pretty strong movie, and I enjoyed it a lot more than I was expecting to. A lot of the jokes caught me off guard with how creative and funny they were, and a lot of the emotional moments and the things these characters are willing to do for one another I found surprisingly charming. It's not a masterpiece that I'd trade a year's worth of lasagna for. Well, okay, I don't like lasagna, so maybe I would, but the point is that it's still an enjoyable movie, and I'm glad I saw it. Also, when I watched the end credits for this movie, I noticed the name Joel Cohen listed as a producer, who was also a writer of the live-action movie. And I was gonna end this video with a joke along the lines of, way to go, Joel Cohen, you made a good Garfield movie. Maybe Chris Pratt won't go around making excuses about confusing your name like Bill Murray did. And then I took a second look and saw the producer's name was actually John Cohen, not Joel. So I guess I'm the one getting the names confused. Go figure.